to Philosophy for Flourishing, a show where we explore principles and practices for living the best, most fulfilled life possible. Today, I'm speaking with philosopher and psychologist Jason Stotts, and he works at what has to be the most fascinating intersection between these two fields, which is sexual ethics. And we're going to talk a little bit about sexual ethics today. I hope this is the first of many conversations in which we'll get much deeper into that topic. But today I figured we start at the very entryway of this topic, which is really exploring the emotional landscape of our lives more generally. So Jason is the author of Eros and Ethos, a new theory of sexual ethics, fascinating book. Definitely recommend you guys check it out. We'll talk more about it as we go on. Jason, thanks so much for being on the show.
Yeah, thanks for having me, John, and what a nice intro.
Well, let's dive in with this topic of emotions in general, because this is one of the things that this book is so rich. There's just so much in it. And this sort of, I would call it a new theory of emotions, although I'm not really steeped in the history of this field. So perhaps you could talk more about your development of this theory and some of the influences. But when I came across this theory, it struck me as entirely new, and it just an extremely clarifying way to conceptualize and examine the emotional landscapes of our lives.
Yeah, so let me kind of start slightly before that, and then talk about my theory and kind of its connection to stuff. So, when I talk about emotions, I talk about it in terms of what I call sentiments, which is kind of a broader category in which emotions are situated. But one of the reasons why I bring that up right now is I want to sort of be clear that I'm not using sort of Hume and Smith, who are sort of some of the older sentimentalists. And one of the reasons why is they think that reason and emotions are fundamentally in opposition. Hume talks about reason as being a slave. It should be the handmaiden of the passions, or I don't remember the exact quote, but I don't think that. I think that reason and our sentiments are very much, they can very much be in line if we understand them and carefully cultivate them. And I think that can lead us to live much better and richer lives. So this is chapter 2 of my book. And as you said, the book is on sexual ethics. And I never set out to write a theory of emotions when I started writing about sex, but I couldn't find the sort of theoretical underpinnings for a lot of what I needed to understand sex. And this chapter actually really kind of got going because I was trying to understand sexual attraction, and I couldn't find a lot of research on it, and I couldn't find a lot of information like how it works. And even sort of the history of sexual ethics doesn't have a lot of information on that. And as I really started drilling down into sexual attraction and desire and these things, I needed some sort of theoretical foundation to understand them. And so that kind of sent me back to the emotions. And I was like, wait, but there's all this other stuff. Like, how do we handle like moods? Like, what's a mood compared to an emotion? And what about like anxiety and depression? Like, what are those things? And it started getting more and more complicated. I was like, I'm just going to need to make a theory of sentiments at this point. So that's kind of how it got started. And the history of psychology prior to really the 1950s is not great. People used to talk about the passions, right? That's from the Latin to suffer. It's just these things that the gods give us, emotions are irreducible primaries. Even the English word melancholy. Like kind of having sad and down and stuff. It comes from the Greek for black bile. It's literally the Greek words for black bile. So, yeah, right. Like our biles and our humors and the gods and whatever, right? That's what emotions are. They're just these things that we suffer. We are not agents in this process. We are mere passive vessels for whatever the universe gets to throw at us in all these myriad ways. In the 1950s, this kind of changed. The 1900 modern psychology starts with Freud, and Freud is an interesting guy, and some of what he says is right, but most of what he says is wrong. So many of his theories kind of at the fundamental level talk about us wanting to have sex with our mother or our father or fearing castration. And yes, your face is amazing. That's kind of what you should be doing. uh, but like, how are we supposed to use that, right? I don't know. It doesn't really make much sense, and psychoanalysis doesn't really yield good results. People, if they get better from psychoanalysis, which they don't have super high success rates, but it takes 5 years sometimes of weekly sessions of an hour or more. Who has time for that? Like, it's not really, in any sense, an evidence-based practice, right? Um, you have Jung, who's a psychologist who goes out into the woods, into a cabin for 3 months, and he comes up with this idea of archetypes, which allegedly explain all of human cognition and emotions. Why? I don't know, because they just do. Not very scientific, right? In the 1950s, a man named Albert Ellis was trying to use Freud's theories to help people, and he's like, this just isn't working. Like, these people aren't getting better. It's taking forever. What am I supposed to do with this? Ellis, he starts casting around, and he looks to the ancients. And one of the things he reads is Epictetus. He reads the Enchiridion. In the passage that changed things is this passage: man is disturbed not by things, but the view he takes of them. And it may not sound that important, but what changed right here is that our emotions are not these sort of external things that we suffer, but our emotions are a function of our beliefs. Now, he could have found Aristotle, and Aristotle actually has an account of sort of belief, emotions in response to our belief. He talks about anger, being angry in the right way, the right people, etc. But he found the Stoics, and there are some good elements of the Stoics. Unfortunately, Stoicism is a religion and not actually a philosophy. So Stoicism relies on this idea of reincarnation, or going to a sort of a divine other plane with logos, to really justify why we should be indifferent to externals, right? So why is it okay that I'm indifferent to externals? Well, this world's not really real, so like, let's not focus on it. And I guess, sort of as a tangent, the idea of apatheia is very damaging, I think, to people's flourishing. But the idea of ataraxia, or just internal peace, is actually kind of a good idea. So you can separate those. But Ellis takes this idea that our emotions stem from our beliefs, and he runs with it. And this creates what we call modern cognitive psychology. Ellis's theories don't really take hold across the board, but a man named Aaron Beck finds them. And he starts this thing called cognitive behavior therapy. And that just takes off. CBT has dominated the field because it gives us a framework for understanding emotions and how all these things work. And Beck credits Ellis. So I say that, one, just maybe it's kind of interesting. I think history of psychology is kind of cool. But two, my work is sort of very much in line with this cognitive tradition of Ellis and Beck. And part of what's different about my theory, and we'll sort of get to that, is this sort of new categories of existential orientation, existential moods, is sort of underlying, like, anxiety, depression for existential moods, and what Ayn Rand calls sense of life for existential orientation. And those are kind of the big differences between what we might think of as sort of traditional cognitive, the cognitive model in psychology, and in my theory. So super long answer to your question, but that's kind of
it's fascinating. And it's interesting how many different instances there are just in that explanation of necessity being the mother of invention. You needed a new theory of emotions to explain sexual attraction. Ellis needed something that would actually work in treating his patients. And so he had to, you mentioned he went back to the Stoics for this idea that today it seems like something we might just take for granted.
Oh, yeah.
Is this because we live in a culture that has already very much taken up this idea and filtered it through our various channels of culture, whether it be literature and art? But, talk a little bit about that. How revolutionary was this idea of Ellis's? I mean, of course, he's pulling from the Stoics, and there was Aristotle before them. But it just seems like something we take for granted today, and perhaps it's not been with us for that long.
No, yes, very much so. It is new, and you're right that we take it for granted today. We're 70 years past the cognitive revolution, really, in psychology, and it has sort of changed the way we think about our emotions. And even just a simple question like, John, why do you love music? Right? You could actually answer that question, and you understand that the question is asking for reasons.
Because I don't think it's just black bile that causes me to feel
Right.
music,
Yeah,
right?
you're not going to say like, oh, well, the ratio of red bile to black bile today was kind of, you're not going to say that, right? You're going to say, well, it really fulfills maybe some deep needs for me. I really enjoy the experience. I have these sort of memories of playing music. You're going to give me a cognitive account of your emotion or your passion. And I talk in the book about love sort of being love. We could treat sort of different kinds of love for a person maybe versus love for things, and we can use the same word in really in the same ways. But one of the things that unites all instances of love is that we internalize these values as deeply important and constitutive of us, so they actually become part of what we need to explain ourselves. And if you say you love music, you're actually saying that it's so important to you that you can't really define who John is without this thing, right? And then someone could ask you why, and you understand that question, right? And we have this very cognitive way of understanding all of this stuff, and it makes sense. Like, it all kind of works. Like, no one's like, "Oh, I love music." Someone's like, "Why?" And they're like, "What do you mean, why?" Like, that's a weird question. We understand these questions today, and yeah, the zeitgeist has
Yeah.
changed around it.
Well, in a sense, it's a weird question. In another sense, it's still a hard one to answer, right? Because we
Oh,
don't
sure.
know why John loves music, for instance. But before we go there, I'm curious about Freud's sort of answer to this type of question. Why does John love music? Does this go back to the some sort of sexual fantasy with one's parents things? Or how would people in Freud's day have answered that kind of question?
I honestly am not competent to answer that particular question.
It
Uh,
is.
we don't really train. So there are very few
Yeah.
schools of psychoanalysis left. We don't really train people in it. There are some of Freud's theories that we kind of use. So this idea of transference and countertransference we actually still use.
Hmm.
Most of his stuff is kind of gone. We talk about defense mechanisms a little bit, but not kind of in the way he did. There are very few clinicians left in the world who practice psychoanalysis. They do still exist, but they are few, and we aren't training hardly anyone in it. In most schools, if you like go out and get a master's or a doctorate of psychology, you're probably not going to get any Freud in your training.
Yeah. And I guess the psychoanalysis would really be more the method than the content. So that would, even if they study psychoanalysis still, which is unlikely and only a small percentage probably do, they still might not be able to answer this question of how would Freud answer this question, because it's,
Well, psychoanalysis, it sounds like a general term, but it would be like the same as objectivism, right? It means something very particular. So it means if when someone says, especially who knows about psychology, psychoanalysis, they mean Freud. They don't mean like a general technique. They mean this is Freud's theory.
okay. So it's not just you're on the couch being
No,
interviewed.
no, we kind of
It's
call that
still,
generally talk therapy nowadays.
you
Like,
know,
so.
yeah, not to, I guess that would be a way over narrow generalization or way of characterizing psychoanalysis, because it's not as if the couch and the talk has gone away at all.
No,
Uh,
although actually a few of us have that kind of couch, which I kind of want one, but I don't have one.
and now I presume everything's moved online for the most part, so it almost doesn't matter what furniture you have in the office.
Yeah, that is true. Most of us are online now, and in fact, I'm in Ontario, and we were actually mandated to be online for a long time. Our regulatory colleges, because of COVID, when COVID first hit, like you can't see people in person unless there's like a really, really good reason to. So most of us have been practicing almost exclusively online for a long time now, and
Wow.
it was weird at first, and we all kind of adapted. And some studies have come out saying, for many people, it's just as good and sometimes even
Huh.
better, because there's no one of the problems getting people in therapy is like, well, one, it's expensive. Two, it takes a lot of time. Three, it's very challenging. Before you have to get there, and like if my office is half an hour from your house, like that's an
Yeah.
hour extra travel time, and maybe you have to find parking and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Maybe you're gonna see people in the waiting room. Maybe you have some social anxiety. It's another barrier we can remove. And while some people still want kind of in-person treatment, many people are really happy with the virtual model. So
Very interesting. I know this is a little bit of a tangent, but I want to explore this for just a second. So I find that really fascinating because, of course, yeah, it's way less convenient to go there in person. But one of the markers of psychological health, at least in my layman's knowledge, is does this person have social interaction with other people? And
mhm.
I know that some have said that you don't really get it through the internet. But I think those some have primarily been looking at social media, which is just this very superficial use of attempt at connection, which obviously doesn't even sound like it's going to work, and we're finding it doesn't. But do you know of these studies if they've examined anything related to social connectedness and how that plays into the effectiveness of online treatment?
Well, not that particular question, but the research studies were about outcomes, right? So we've got people seeking clinicians like me, like I do sex therapy and trauma and other stuff. When they come to us, do they get better? It's really the question we were seeking to answer. And how has that changed? Did treatment outcomes change with the virtual model? And the answer is, for most people, really no. That many people, the treatment outcomes were really in line with what we expected. So over the course of the pandemic, I was working during part of that for an outpatient rehab, doing working with people who were injured. So a lot of trauma disorders, somatic symptom disorders, like pain kind of gets entrenched in the body for psychological reasons, not merely physiological reasons. And I treated a lot of people for PTSD, for example, during that time period virtually, and they, generally got better. Our success rates for PTSD aren't perfect, but we have some very good treatment options that have very high success rates, and people do by and large get better, and many of the people I treated did get better, and it didn't seem like it made a whole lot of difference that it was virtual versus not.
Yeah, it's really interesting because I know another therapist who told me that a lot of his patients seemed much happier because many of them have social anxiety, and they get really anxious having to be around other people, being in close contact with people, having face-to-face conversations. And so for better or for worse, I'm not sure, like long-term health-wise, whether this would actually lead to more flourishing, but he said just, anecdotally, that it seemed like a lot of people were happier because they didn't have to go and be around people and have lots of conversations like that.
Yeah, and sort of add a wrinkle to your question. When we talk about social connectedness, I don't think the therapist relationship probably counts because it's not a bi-directional relationship.
Okay.
Right. So when someone comes to see me for treatment, I learn everything about their life. And they learn basically nothing about me. And partly that's on purpose. If a client starts treating me too much as a person, they're going to start worrying about my feelings. Are they telling me too much? Are they overloading me? Blah, 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 blah. Right. That doesn't need to be part of the equation. Right. We're not there to have a friendship. I'm there to help them work through whatever sort of mental health stuff is going on. And the more they treat me as a person, that actually can impair my ability to do it, which is why we have often at least norms, if not laws, against self-disclosure and all this kind of stuff, because we can impair the process.
Wow.
So I'm not sure it counts. Like
Yeah.
it's a social connection, maybe in some sense, but maybe not the relevant sense for the question.
Yeah, it'd be interesting to delve into what the actual meaning of social connection is. Is it sharing your problems? Is it hearing other people's? Is it back and forth? I don't know.
I would assume it has something to do with intimacy and vulnerability. And if it's unidirectional, I would think that it probably doesn't sort of have the same sort of emotional cognitive need that we're talking about with social connectedness.
Yeah, that's fascinating. So you're talking about helping people work through their problems. We talked earlier about my love of music, but there's an overarching framework for thinking about all of these things that you've come up with, is this sentiments framework. And I'd love to get into what the different what the different categories of sentiments are and what their responses to.
Okay. Yeah, let's delve into the theory now. So broadly speaking, the sentiments, all the sentiments, they let us experience the reality of our values and beliefs. And this is one of the really key things to remember as we talk about this, because they have an incredibly important function in our lives. And this is the way that we make meaning. This is the way that we experience meaning. This is the way that we experience the significance of our achievements, etc. So it's really one of the major keys, I think, for flourishing and living a human life, if we want it to sort of be meaningful and valuable and these kind of things, right? In another sort of caveat, we're going to start really teasing apart sentiments and talking about some really complicated stuff, but we do not experience them the way we're about to discuss, right? We experience them as the sort of immediate being stricken by the gods, the experience is immediate and we don't see what's behind it unless we're really, really looking and have a lot of practice. So despite us, we're going to really start tearing these things apart. That is not our experience. We all know that, but it's helpful. Sometimes people are like, oh, but that's not the way I experienced. Like, yes, that's true. And also, unhelpful if we want to really dig into it. So I talk about, in terms of underlying the sentiments, there's this thing I call the sentimental process. And, people can go to the book for sort of really going in depth into it, but it has three fundamental phases: identification. So, what is it? Evaluation and response. Identification is no more than really what is it. You have to kind of know what the thing is. In my book, one of the examples I give, and again, no one do this, but if you were to point a gun at an infant, the infant would feel no fear. Right. So I'm going to repeat the caveat: do not do this. But the infant would have no experience of it as being dangerous. It has no way of knowing. Right. You do the same thing to an adult. It also could be like, hey, whoa, 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 whoa. Right. Don't point a gun at me. Right. Dangerous. The infant can identify that thing is dangerous. It would, a very slightly older infant could identify a snake, for example, as dangerous. It's partly innate in us to fear that thing, but not guns. They're too new. Evaluation. So this is, I call it evaluation, but really perhaps it's more properly speaking, subconscious correspondence. But how does this thing connect to my values and beliefs? And part of the reason why I say it's more properly subconscious correspondence is evaluation is really a conscious thing that we do where we judge something and its value in our life. This is more of a subconscious version of that, where it connects to our antecedent values, the things that we've internalized. So it's different than conscious evaluation. And the last is just the response, right? Like, so how are we oriented to it? What do we feel? What do we think? And those are the sort of three: identification, evaluation, response. Now, again, sorry, go ahead.
Well, with identification, how much is that similar to the subconscious correspondence? I'm curious about the sort of snake counterexample to the need for some sort of knowledge about the thing. Do we need to identify it at any conscious level, or is this something that happens below the surface?
There are very few things that are kind of sort of innate things that we do where we might, reflexes, or I don't think we really want to say innate knowledge, because I don't think it's actually knowledge, but humans in general will fear certain kind of things. And it's sort of just evolutionary programmed into us because these things used to kill our ancestors and we don't want to die. Right. So we all have this reaction, and we've all had experiences like walking through the woods. You see a stick, you kind of jump, you're like, oh, it's just a stick, or seeing a snake and you feel a little bit of fear. You can overcome it, and it's not knowledge, but there are very, very few of these things. So I'm not sure that like hanging too much on that's going to be helpful, because there just aren't many. Do what? Yeah, they are. They're borderline in their. You can actually, like, psychology is listed basically all of them. You can find charts of like these things, right? So you can go look them up. You have to identify it at some level, and generally it has to be, you have to kind of understand it in order to understand how it connects to you. Right. But if you can't understand what it is, there's no way to understand how it connects to you. And that's kind of the two different pieces, right? Identification versus the correspondence. What is it and how does it connect to me? That's kind of the distinction.
I see. And they both can be at some level subconscious. You're not identifying gun, dangerous, danger to my values, ergo, I'm going to feel this way about it.
Right. Yeah. None of us experience our emotions that way. Right. This entire process is subconscious, but it relies on information from consciousness that's been internalized. Right. So if you don't understand what a gun is, like, you take back a gun to medieval times, you point it at a knight in armor, the knight's going to be like, okay, you have a weird shiny stick. Right.
That's such a funny example.
Yeah, they'll have no reaction, right? Because even though they're an adult, it's just a weird shiny stick. You're pointing at them. They're wearing armor. They're on their horse. They have got their sword. Like, they're not afraid of your weird shiny stick. So you have to really understand what it is and how it connects to you in order to have any kind of emotional reaction. They're going to have no emotional reaction, or maybe they'll mock you, right? Like, they're not going to have a fear-based reaction like we would expect them to have, because we know what it is and we know what it does.
Takes me back to Monty Python. What are you going to do? Tug me to death? You that right? Shiny stick.
So yeah, I mean, so that's the distinction, and we really do need to know it at some level to have any kind of reaction to it.
Mhm.
And we can actually fear things that we don't know. We can be afraid of the unknown, but that's kind of its own category. Like we all sort of have, many people have a trepidation about things that they don't know, and that's more kind of complicated, goes into like control and
Yeah.
knowledge and this kind of stuff.
And that must tie into some of the deeper beliefs that we're going to talk about here in a minute. So this what you just laid out is a sentimental process, right? Is there
Mhm.
more to that, or should we move on to the full framework of sentiments?
That's probably enough. I mean, there's more in the book, but I don't want to get too bogged down. One really important point, though, is, and this is critical, our emotions, our sentiments do not correspond to the world directly.
Mm.
Um, People often sort of make this mistake. They correspond to our beliefs about the world.
This was Epictetus's point, right?
Yeah, it is Epictetus' point, and it's also sort of something we can all understand. And so let me give you an example. So let's say you have a particularly valuable, I don't know, guitar, since we're talking to
I
you.
do.
Uh, so let's say that you go to your, I presume you have a guitar room. I don't know. You go
I
to
do
your
have a
guitar.
studio. Yeah.
Nice. There you go. You have a studio. So you go to your studio. You go to get your favorite guitar, and it's not there.
Mm.
Right. You're gonna have an emotional reaction. What kind of emotional reaction do you think you might have?
Well, it's going to start with questioning, and then it's going to go to theorizing. Well, the emotional reaction. Um,
You're probably
it's
like,
going to be this
where's my
secure.
guitar? Right. You're gonna be
Yeah,
like curious, confused, maybe like, I had a guitar.
confused.
It's right there,
Yeah.
but it's not. Where's my guitar? Right. So let's say that so you start asking these questions. So you have your emotional reaction. Now you start your sort of more conscious intellectual process. You're like, okay, well, it's got to be somewhere. It didn't just disappear, right? Object permanence, all that stuff. So, okay, it's not where it was. You look around the house, you don't see it. You're like, where's my guitar? Right now you're just getting more confused, sort of maybe a little upset. Uh, let's say that you remember, like, oh, I took it to the shop. It needed, one of the frets got broken. I took it to the shop. I need to get it fixed. uh, what would you feel now?
Relief.
Okay. Now, if your emotions were to the reality itself directly, you would have never been confused,
Right.
and you would have never felt relief, right?
It's not like my eyes that are perceiving something and they can only perceive in a certain way. Reality has this sort of causal efficacy that, causes me via my sense modalities to see things in a certain way. Emotions are not like that, is what you're saying, right? They're
Right. Because if they were about,
response.
yeah, they're about your belief that it was missing, and then
Mm,
your realization that it wasn't.
yeah.
Those two beliefs form the core of your actions. And then, we have to, there's going to be lots of other beliefs, like I value my guitar, my car was expensive, it's particularly nice. All these other beliefs are going to factor in. But if it was directly to the world, you would have never been confused, because in the world, the guitar was in fact not lost. It was at the shop, right?
Yeah.
And if we had this sort of divine knowledge, which is obviously fantastical, but if we had that, our emotions would look really, really different.
Mm,
Uh, and so as we talk about this, it's really important to remember that our emotions are about our beliefs and not the world directly. We
hmm.
should try to make them about the world as closely as we can, and using reason and being rational and testing our beliefs and using like intellectual virtues and things will help us get closer. We should try to get them as close as possible, but they are not directly about the world. They're only as accurate to the world as our beliefs are accurate to the world.
That's a really interesting observation about really the connection between divine knowledge and emotions, not in so much as there's anything really there to go after, but like it reminds me of monks and other people that are seeking some sort of spiritual release from the world. It's as though they're seeking a a generalized knowledge of everything such that they can feel nothing but peace. So perhaps too big a segue there, but too big
Yeah,
a jump. But
it's a complicated question, because each religion sort of has their own philosophical framework. So, but generally they rely on something. They all kind of rely on this idea that this reality is not as important as whatever the other one is. So maybe that's the reincarnation and that process, the sort of underlying process, more important, or whatever kind of heaven they imagine or hell or whatever. It's something that's not reality. It's kind of driving a lot of this. And each flavor is going to have sort of different quirks and nuances. So
yeah, and the idea behind it, I guess that the connection I was making is that, well, I have knowledge of the reality that it is really important. And so I'm not going to let this reality have any sort of a impact on my emotion because this is not important.
right, and that's exactly the Stoic move for apatheia, right? So the Stoic move for apatheia is this world, the world of externals doesn't really matter. Because what we need to do is focus on the internal world, the cultivation of virtue, so that when we die, our soul will go to logos, this other world, the world of pure reason. That's the Stoic move for apatheia. And I know we're not really talking about Stoicism, but the apatheia ataraxia distinction is incredibly important because ataraxia, sort of contentment, internal peace, is actually a good goal. Apatheia, indifference to the external world, is actually a terrible anti-flourishing goal. So it depends on when we talk about Stoicism. You can sort of see both strains in Stoicism, and different sort of commentators and philosophers will take one or the other, and you get really different kind of outcomes from what you want out of Stoicism, depending on which one you focus on, ataraxia or apatheia.
Yeah. Yeah, and perhaps they think that apatheia is the route to ataraxia.
The ones who think in the sort of the external world do, but many sort of modern Stoics eschew sort of the more mystical apatheia otherworld side, and they try to focus just on ataraxia, and that's a much better version of Stoicism. So it kind of depends, like the more modern, what we might call Stoics, focus more that way.
So the connection between all of this and our emotional lives, understanding those lives and taking more control of them. How do we do that?
Yeah, so let's talk about the different kinds of emotions and stuff, and then that will help us sort of understand that question, because we need to sort of delve in a little bit deeper to sort of answer that one, which is an important question, and 100% let's get there. So I define all sentiments as a form of automatic evaluative awareness that orients us to their object and our experience as a cognitive conviction, and often with attendant affect. So there's a lot in this sort of definition. Automatic evaluative awareness is that it lets us feel our evaluations of the object. It orients us to whatever the object is that we're feeling an emotion about. We have a cognitive conviction, and we often have attendant affect. Attendant affect is the things we feel in our body. When we have emotions, we always have cognitive components, and we frequently, if not usually, have affective ones, but not necessarily, right? So, for example, if I say I love my wife, I have certain kind of orientation to her and a certain cognitive conviction, but I may or may not be reporting that I feel certain sort of warm feelings in my body at any particular moment. In fact, I often would not be reporting that. So I don't necessarily always have attendant affect, even though I usually do. Love is an example of an emotion, right? Emotions are things like love, hate, irritation. The object of emotions are definite things. They can be things in the world, they can be things sort of in our mental world. So, for example, Tui resents Rourke, or Ein loved Frank, are both emotions, right? And we can understand who the sort of person having them is and the object of emotion, and the emotion links those two things. It's an orientation of the person to the object.
So I just want to really hammer on this. There's, with emotions in this breakdown here, we're breaking down what I'm calling the emotional landscape, or I think this is your theory of sentiments. So we're going to talk about, I think, 4 different types of sentiments.
Right.
And with emotions, they are directed toward a specific object. You can, if it's not something you can physically point to, it's something mentally you can isolate and point to cognitively to say, okay, well, this is the thing that is causing this emotion. Is that right?
Yes. And those are first order emotions. Second order emotions are emotions about emotions. But those also are particular objects, right? But yes. You can actually have third, right? So you can even have third order emotions. So John loves Sally, but John is irritated by his love of Sally. He's also upset with himself that he keeps doing this.
It's right? Like every rock song, pop song ever written, right?
Yeah, you can actually, the orders of emotions keep going because we're very complicated creatures and sort of the way we feel. We're not necessarily going to get into all those orders, but they exist. But it's going to complicate sort of the understanding if we go too far that way, right?
Yeah, we don't need that stuff. But they all follow the same principle. In each case, there's a very definite object of the emotion. So it's very easy to sort of say, okay, this is what emotions are. They have a definite object. They have something cognitive that's happening, but also there's typically a sort of physiological, or as you put it, affective state. Is that right?
That's exactly right. Now, the sort of second one I call moods, and moods are exactly what they sound like. So joy, sorrow, excitement. The object of moods is indefinite. It's kind of the way your life is going, but proximately. Today, this week, a very short amount of time. An example might be Sally experiencing joy because she slept well, finished a project, had a nice lunch, she met with some old friends, and she feels joyful today. It's not necessarily a reflection of how the course of her life is going. It's today she did a bunch of stuff, and it's not that any one particular of those things is the joy, sort of the object of joy. It's her day is going in a certain way, maybe her week is going a certain way, and she feels joy because of that, right? Indefinite in that there's not like a object. There's a sort of a cluster of things that from which the mood arises.
Yeah, and I mean, in a sense, you can trace the mood back, like you just did, to certain things, right? There's certain objects that are ultimately the cause of that mood, but the mood is a more generalized feeling about your emotions and your life in at that moment.
Yeah, so there are things that jointly constitute the mood, from which the mood arises, but it doesn't arise to a particular object. So by indefinite, I mean there's not like one thing you could point to, right?
Yeah,
it's kind of this cluster of things that a mood arises out of.
Interesting. So yeah, if we're graphing this somehow, we might have, different points at the bottom of our graph that lead to certain emotional responses that then lead to certain moods, maybe just visually.
Yeah, but so like in Sally's example, so slept well, finished a project, had lunch with friends, whatever I said. She may not have an emotion about any one of those particular things, right? So you can't necessarily say she had emotion about X, Y, Z, because of the summation of that, you get mood delta, whatever, right?
Yeah, I might not have an emotional reaction to the fact that I slept well, but it's certainly
right.
My mood.
Yeah, see, that's the thing, and it's complicated, and we're really kind of leaning on the cognitive side. There's also sort of a physiological side here. So sleeping well, it has physiological impact. We're not really getting into it as much, but yeah, it emerges from the joint conjunction of these things coming together to create the mood, not the individual things. You can't sort of do like a summation of the particular data points here, right?
Right. So we've got emotions that have definite objects. We've got moods that are a bit more generalized. What's our next level of detail in this landscape of emotions?
Yeah, so this is what I call existential moods, and this is new to me. Actually, I took the term from someone else, and there's a footnote in my book where it's not my nicest footnote, but I took the term from someone else, and they didn't really use it much. And by existential moods, I mean things like anxiety, depression, tranquility, pride. The object is indefinite, but the sort of thing we're talking about is the way the course of my life is going. So it's a very broad judgment of the course of your life.
Broader than a mood.
Yeah, because a mood is like, how is my day or my week going?
Mm-hmm.
This is how is my life going?
Yeah.
Right. So it's everything. So, an example might be John feels proud because of his hard work over the course of grad school. He's paying off. He's doing well in his career. He's achieving his values, and he feels pride. It's not that he feels pride about today or this week. He feels pride about the course of his life, right? All the hard work he put in grad school and doing really well in his career and achieving his values in certain ways. He's starting to really flourish, and he feels pride in that fact, right? But it's not any particular day that you feel pride about necessarily, right? It's just sort of this course of your life. And when I say pride here, I mean sort of the emotional element of pride, not necessarily the direct virtue, because the emotion rises out of the virtue, but they're not the same thing, right? So I mean sort of the affective cognitive convictions of pride, not necessarily per se the virtue, although hopefully we do also mean the virtue, but they're not the same here.
Yeah, we're talking about really the effects, right? The effects of our virtues and of our actions in our lives. This theory of sentiments is really capturing that. And there are things that are corresponding that underlie them and underlie achieving them, right?
Right.
So we've got on the table emotions, moods, and existential moods.
Right.
But it gets deeper, doesn't it?
It does. One thing about existential moods, though, is they often sort of hang on what we might call an existential moment. And there's certain sort of moments in life where you can sort of see the course of your life in a way that you can't usually. A wedding, a death, a birth, a child, a major promotion. It's just kind of these moments we sit back and we kind of see the course of our life in a way that we don't often do. And those are very rare and very powerful and poignant. And some people can experience this by looking at certain kinds of artworks. They can actually have almost an existential moment by seeing the sort of instantiated values in the artwork, and that is a reflection of sort of their life. So that's actually, I think, a really interesting connection with like art. For example, when people talk about their emotional responses, I think they're generally having sort of an existential moment in these cases.
When it's a really strong response to the art and you feel something about, okay, this sums up something about my life or something that's important to me.
Yeah, that particular kind of emotional reaction.
Yeah, it's really interesting to go meta here for a second. There's a novel called The Midnight Library by Matt Haig, and it's an artwork that is about an existential moment.
Yeah.
That spans the entirety of the book, of the plot. And I would love to hear, it's at some point, if you're interested and you ever get around to it, I'd love to hear the thoughts of somebody that has more psychological perceptiveness than I do on this book. But I found it absolutely fascinating the way that an entire story unfolds within this existential moment.
You couldn't have planned that connection better if you tried. Yeah, I when we get done, give me the name of the book again. I'll check it out. Existential moods are also they're a really major part of a person's personality and identity. So our existential moods, they often sort of are a running narrative. Think of someone who is anxious or depressive, right? Like that's a major part of how they experience the world and actually how we think of other people too, existential moods. The sort of last category is I call existential orientation. It's very similar to Ayn Rand's idea of sense of life. So there's really no name for the different existential orientations in English, or really probably in any language. It's kind of a new idea, but it's our way of being oriented to existence. Part of why I say that it's similar to sense of life but different. Ayn Rand talks about sense of life as having kind of two objects, myself and the world. And I think it has three objects: myself, other people in the world. And I go I compare and contrast them in my book, which I don't necessarily think I want to get into, but having three distinct categories is really important. And you can see that part of what makes me say that is when I treat people, I can often see distinctions in these categories for other people versus the world that are really can be critical to psychological treatment. And like Rand wouldn't have seen that because that wasn't what she did, right? She didn't treat people clinically. And I think really the place it's most important is kind of in clinical treatment, but also really helps us sort of understand our sentiments. So someone who has, let's say, a negative core belief, which we'll kind of get into in a minute, maybe, around other people are dangerous, but the world is still a place I can flourish, is going to have a different kind of existential orientation than someone who has an idea that the world is evil, but other people will help me. Like those are not going to have the same kind of emotional, sentimental reaction.
An interesting conflict there between different core beliefs.
Yeah, and she can't draw that distinction the way she drew sense of life. She would have to say like myself versus sort of everything else. And there's that subtle distinction between the world is bad, other people are good, versus other people are good, the world is bad. She can't draw.
All right. So for those not super familiar with Ayn Rand, we're talking about the philosopher and novelist Ayn Rand. And this concept, this phrase, sense of life, she said, it is one's automatic, subconsciously integrated view of man and of the world, right?
Right.
So she said, it's really the essence of a person's character. It's what makes a person's personality that personality. It's their basic view of the world and everything in it. And I wonder, I would love to, obviously we'd all love to have this conversation with Rand herself, but I wonder to what extent she had in mind others when she said a view of man and of existence, because man would include oneself, of course, but it might include other people.
So it's a very interesting question. I really wish she had written more on this topic. I think it's one of the most interesting places she wrote on, one of the most interesting in all of Objectivism. It's almost entirely in the Romantic Manifesto, which is talking about art and how to understand it. I wish she had written more. I read it as sort of being, there's two categories, and in the book I kind of go into why, and I point to some passages where I sort of think why I think that. So people who are interested in my view, if someone has really good sort of textual reasons for thinking that the sort of self versus other, the other sort of can be broken into discrete categories, I would love to see them. But the way that she wrote it, it seems like she's kind of saying other people in the world are sort of similar, or sort of in the same sort of cognitive bucket, maybe. So there's sort of this breakdown between self and other, right? And other maybe includes the world. And if that's true, then it kind of, I think it glosses over the sort of important psychological distinction between other people and the world itself, because they can cash out really differently in different existential orientations that way. I'm not trying to say that she's necessarily wrong. I think that, as I said, I wish this is something she'd written much more about, because I think it's one of the, it's amazing philosophical insights. And considering when she was writing this, the cognitive revolution had barely gotten going. And interestingly, Albert Ellis, who I talked about earlier, and Ayn Rand had a long connection that kind of broke down after they had this sort of, I guess, debate, but it didn't. Ayn Rand sort of had certain expectations about how it would go. Ellis had different expectations. It didn't sort of meet Rand's expectations, and she was very upset. And there was sort of a falling out. And then Ellis wrote a book about how Objectivism is a cult. And so it kind of devolved into a big thing, but they actually had a lot of correspondence prior to it. And so Rand actually may have had some hand in influencing the sort of cognitive revolution. And that's as much as I can say, because that's sort of where my knowledge stops. But I would be just super interested in this question, like how much did she affect the cognitive revolution? Can we point to sort of some of modern psychology being her influence?
Yeah, that's a fascinating question. And I know I've already sort of pulled your arm to do some research and write an article on this. I really would love to see that. Okay, so one more thought on this topic about Rand, sense of life, and your sentiments theory. I agree. This has to be one of the most fascinating and understudied aspects of Rand's thought. And I'm, in part, I actually came to your book. I picked it up before and set it down, but I came back to it because I'm doing a reading group on Ayn Rand's Romantic Manifesto, her aesthetic theory, and came across Sense of Life and was just looking for other material on this. And you're one of the few people that's done some work on this subject. But in terms of other textual evidence for Rand's view, one thing that comes to mind is it's not in her nonfiction. We know that she wrote very little on this topic, but in her fiction, she often portrays characters who have views about themselves and views about other people, which, perhaps we could conflate to some extent with views about the world as such. But it doesn't really always seem to cash out that way. So like one person that comes to mind, one character that comes to mind is Dominique Franquin from Ayn Rand's The Fountainhead. And Dominique has a view of herself. She is a very uplifted person. She has a very uplifted view of the world. She's in love with heroism. She loves heroes. She loves the heroic, but she has a view of other people, a generalized view of society as well, as being absolutely inimical to her type of values. And thus, she doesn't even want to share her values with the world. She actually wants to find, there's this scene where it's just so revealing of her character. She finds this Greek statue of Helios that she's in love with. And what does she do? She buys it and then she throws it down an air shaft so that it could smash in the concrete below, because she doesn't want anyone else to share this value, to have access to this value, because they're petty and anti-value in a way. So I wonder, perhaps another conversation we can have another time and a little bit more deeply, but like, to what extent did Rand flesh out her ideas on sense of life in her fiction? Would be an interesting thing to get into.
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. So reality exists, right? And this is not a controversial statement, but if we're right, this is how humans work. She could be pointing to the same stuff in reality and it not show up in the nonfiction. You know what I mean? Like her characterization, because she understands human psychology very well, better than most, maybe even. She could be getting it right sort of in the nonfiction, but maybe not really elaborate it, or sorry, in the fiction, but not really elaborate in the nonfiction, because it's just a fact of reality, right?
So,
I don't consider really myself an expert on her on this point, and I would need to do a lot more sort of analysis to answer the question in some ways. But my sense from what I do know is that she doesn't really at least carve out the sort of three categories sufficiently that we could that they can be utilized in sort of the ways we need to in psychology, and sort of understanding the sentiments. And I'm not saying that she necessarily didn't catch it, because like I think you're right, in the fiction it does show up, but does it show up in the nonfiction? Does she sort of understand that they're distinct categories? I don't know, and I guess I'm not really feeling the most confident on that point. So
yeah, you're totally right. I mean, you as a practicing professional in the field of psychology need to have these conceptual handles on what's actually happening in the world. And that's why we need certain concepts, really. It's because we need to be able to grasp these things so that we can think about them and act appropriately. And I think you're absolutely right that if she did think in these terms, she didn't flesh this out in the way that you have. And the reason we're talking is because I think that this theory that you've come up with on sentiments is just so incredibly useful and clarifying. So we've got on the table the 4 categories of sentiments now. So emotions have a direct object. Moods are sort of, how is my life going right now, maybe today, maybe this week. Existential moods are, how's my life going overall? And then existential orientation is, well, I guess maybe I've mixed these up a little bit. Existential orientation is your generalized view of the world, yourself, and other people. Is that right?
yeah, so existential orientation is, I think, maybe the hardest to understand. And to be fair, my view of this is very much influenced by Rand. So, there is, her influence is very much here. But is right. So three objects: myself, other people, in the world. And our existential orientation arises from our core beliefs, which is one of the insights of sort of modern psychology. And our core beliefs are they're a running narrative below the level of sort of consciousness. So we can think of sort of conscious thought as being the top level, our internalized values and beliefs that constitute us and that we sort of think are important. But below that, in sort of this non-conscious way, is what we call core beliefs. And one of Rand's insights was that it's a sense of life. So it's not a conscious thing. It's not even usually held in language. It's kind of a sense we have of these things. And this arises because the core beliefs, the sort of existential orientation, starts out in infancy. And as you become a toddler, and it's sort of a running narrative across the entire course of your life. It starts out saying with things like, am I safe? Am I fed? Am I loved? Later, but do I feel sort of connection to other people? Am I securely attached? As you get a little older, can I learn things? Is the world kind of place that's understandable? Are other people going to help me? Are other people going to hurt me? And it's a running narrative of all of these things, everything you can imagine. And as you sort of become an adolescent, it sort of deepens and gets more complex. When you hit around 18, you're probably going to have a fairly firm sense of your existential orientation. And when you hit 25, it really more or less firms up unless something kind of big happens that forces you to change it. But the running existential orientation, or if you want to say sense of life, is fueled by these core beliefs. And one of the connections to psychology is that if we can understand people's core beliefs, we can change them and actually change the existential orientation, which we'll get to soon. But this idea of it being a running narrative that's held inarticulately. So by inarticulate, I mean it's not held in concepts or language. It's below the level of language, which is why Rand called it a sense. It's really important. This is a running narrative throughout the course of the life. And it's the fundamental way that we orient ourselves to existence, which is why I call it that. And so it's really the foundation of our personality. It's a foundation of how we view the world. It's the foundation of all of our other sentiments, and it affects all of the other sentiments. It affects the way we carry ourselves, the way we groom ourselves, the way we style ourselves, the speech patterns we have. I talk about style in my book, and style is a manifestation of our existential orientation primarily. Style is actually also, interestingly, sort of foundation of this idea of love at first sight or immediate sexual attraction. It's actually a connection to someone's style and thereby a connection to someone's existential orientation. So existential orientation is actually just super important to really truly understand someone's personality and who they are, and also at a second level, what kind of things they will feel.
So it's the result of these core beliefs that are just basic beliefs. Almost, I use the phrase often, operating system.
Mm-hmm.
It's almost like this underlying operating system of a person. It's, like
it would be more like the BIOS than the operating system. So like you could think of OS as sort of our logic and reason and that kind of stuff, but our basic input output, the BIOS, is what is kind of the core beliefs. If everything else is contingent on, if no BIOS, no OS, right?
That's a new term for me, but I like it. Yeah,
BIOS.
so it's underneath all the other beliefs, and it's what makes the person who they are. It's what motivates all their actions. So you gave some examples. I'm wondering if you could give a few more of what some of these core beliefs are.
Sure.
And maybe we can tease out their outcomes and what we can do with this knowledge.
Yeah, so this is one of the primary things we do in psychotherapy, right? So someone comes to psychotherapy and they're like, I'm depressed. One of the things, so there's kind of a lot that goes into this. That there's certain sort of maladaptive thought patterns, but really sort of the deepest, most fundamental work is to understand their existential orientation, understand the core beliefs they have that are driving these, and change those things. And if you can do that, then sort of everything else changes and depression will go away. Let's say, for example, we have someone come in. So someone comes in, they're depressed. They say, no one wants to hang out with me. Like, no, my dates never work. Like, no one cares about me. I'm not connected to anyone. And because of that, like, I feel like there's no point to anything. Like, what's the point? We would start to drill down, and this is really oversimplifying what therapy looks like, but we would probably get down to maybe this core belief of I am unlovable. And if we were doing therapy, we would start looking at like sort of what's the historical origins of that, where'd you get it from? And we would start challenging it and testing it and using sort of psychological techniques to change it. And as we did that, we would see the depression start to lighten up, their symptoms change. They would maybe start to find more meaning. We would also, if this were therapy, we would get them to do certain things like behavioral activation and stress management stuff to sort of help deal with all this. But the fundamental, really the most important part of the work is understanding their essential orientation and what core beliefs are driving it. And it's very challenging because, as I said, it's the fundamental core of their personality, and it's the way that we conceive of everything, and including the way we feel about everything. So it's really hard to see it yourself. It's very, very hard. The odds of you sort of being able to do this on your own are low.
Now, you mentioned, somebody coming in and they say, I'm depressed. That's their mood, perhaps their existential mood right now. It's having a certain impact on their emotions. You mentioned maladaptive thought patterns. And it sounds like your work is largely playing the detective of tracing back whatever you can back to these core beliefs. I'm really curious if there are any, you mentioned psychological techniques. I'm wondering if there are any sort of general tips, tricks types things that people might utilize to start introspecting on their own core beliefs.
Yeah, this is a good question. So one, I don't think it's probably possible to do it in your own head. So if you're going to attempt this, you need to either have someone else to talk to or write about it. It's like use a journal or like voice notes, whatever. Something changes in our thoughts. When they're just in our head, they are kind of amorphous. And I'm sure we've all had this experience of having what we think is an amazing idea, and we go to tell someone, and you're like, oh, that is just a terrible idea. I can't believe these words are coming out of my mouth.
Never happened to me.
Yeah, right. There's something changes when the idea's in our head and we concretize it and we put it out in reality. There's a shift there. So I don't think you could probably do this just in your own head. So either talk to someone about it or journal. So that's step one. Step two, look for places where you're having emotional reactions stuff, especially emotional reactions that you think are discordant. So discordant emotional reactions are ones that sort of aren't consistent with your philosophy or your sort of conscious aims, ones that you don't really like or that aren't serving your life and your flourishing, right? And then start asking yourself questions and drilling down. So, this morning I was angry because as I was walking into the building, Sally from accounting, she just let the door slam in my face. Okay, why am I angry? Well, I'm angry because I thought she saw me and she let the door slam. Okay, well, maybe she didn't see me. That's possible. Or maybe she's mad at me. But no, she has no reason to be mad at me, right? So and maybe she doesn't see me. So maybe I shouldn't be mad at her. Okay, but then why am I mad, right? Why did that affect me so much? Well, I feel like I don't feel like I fit in at the company yet. I feel like maybe my projects aren't going well. Okay, but why does that make me mad? I mean, that's true. Like, yeah, there's connection, but what? What's the connection there? Well, I'm having this really fixed mindset idea that like, if I don't get it right away, then maybe I'm not going to. This is as good as I'm ever going to be. Oh, I don't feel competent. I feel like maybe there's something wrong with me and my ability to do this. This is the kind of process, and it's messy. And the way I'm talking about it is really a best case scenario for doing this. You're not going to get it in a couple minutes. It's going to be messy. It's going to be iterative. It's going to involve a lot of testing, and you're going to have to drill down. Each time you're drilling down a little bit more, getting a little more insight.
Yeah, this is fascinating because it seems like in large part, what fiction enables us to do is to get little vignettes of this type of thing, like really psychologically perceptive fiction does this. Mm-hmm. And to have those as sort of templates almost that you can go back to and think, well, that person had these sorts of thoughts and the author revealed this character's motivations to me through these sorts of details. One can then use that as a sort of template, or like the template you just gave us, to think through, okay, well, what's going on with me? And then you can, like you said, you can get that out on paper where you can reflect on it, where it's not just there and then gone. And
I think that's a really good connection. I think that really good psychologically insightful fiction can give us this kind of insight into ourselves in ways that we might not otherwise be able to get. And I think that's one of the really great values of many kinds of psychologically insightful fiction. It gives us this access to ourselves, but also into other people's motivations. And it really helps us open our eyes to, like, let's say like I'm oriented one way, but someone else oriented the other way. I don't understand them. And then fiction sort of shows me this internal account of someone's internal states and their thought processes and their experiences. And I'm like, oh yeah, no, that actually finally makes sense, right? Like I get it now in a way that I just couldn't have before.
Yeah, this also reminds me of Aristotle's sort of opening to the Nicomachean Ethics, where he says in effect that all things aim at some good, real or perceived. And it's that people are not out there consciously aiming to do bad things. And if we can get into their minds and understand their thought processes, we can have greater empathy. But this, I think, is really the key to great fiction as well, is that a great fiction writer empathizes even with the bad characters enough to be able to analyze and understand what's going on in their psychology and then relay that to us.
Yeah, and there's a connection too with Aristotle and the idea of mirroring in character friendship, right? One of the things our character friends let us do is let us understand ourselves at a much deeper level, because we can see our values and principles reflected in them in their actions, right? So it gives us a sort of depth of insight that is impossible to get otherwise.
Fascinating. So we're delving into these core beliefs. We're getting some handle on what it is we believe. Let's just presume we've had some success with this. What's the next step? Let's just presume, for, this is way oversimplifying things, but we have this spectrum of sense of life where you've got people that are a bit more anxious, a bit more depressed, and then you have people that it doesn't seem to matter what they're faced with. They always face it with a smile and a pep in their step. So let's say that we're closer to this side of the spectrum, and this is just one of many spectrums that I think make up sense of life or existential orientation. How can we start to use that knowledge to get us over to, I think the side that most of us want to be on, which is a bit more optimistic?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. So let me answer it a couple ways. So the first one is that the question is more complicated than you think. So there's another factor that we call temperament in psychology, and we're all born with a temperament, and it's going to have profound impacts on our personality and our existential orientation. And we're not really, at least I guess I'm not aware, I don't think psychology is aware of sort of the exact origins, whether it's genetic or epigenetic. But so, for example, people who show a ton of activation in the right prefrontal cortex tend to be more anxious and depressive, and people who show more activation in the left prefrontal cortex are happier. And how do you change your prefrontal cortex activation? It is not easy.
Just tell yourself, I'm going to use more of my left brain instead of my right today.
Yeah, well, it's actually it's the front, and so it's like the side of the front, really. We're talking about like here. But so there are ways. So cognitive therapy can help us to change our thought patterns and shift to sort of a more positive thing. And it can, so there's this idea in psychology called happiness set point, that we all sort of have a set point because our temperament and personality, that our happiness will return to, or sort of a viewing of existence, no matter what happens to us, good or bad, right? So something really good happens, we'll come back to set point. Something really bad happens, we'll come back to set point. And this might take a couple of years. So even someone who's paralyzed, for example, like happy person is paralyzed, after a couple of years, they'll probably be right back to the same happiness set point. So that's a wrinkle. Cognitive therapy can change the way we think about these things, so it can shift us more towards the happy side by getting rid of many of the impediments, the bad styles of thinking, the core beliefs that are dragging down the existential orientation. There are other things we can do. So we can actually strengthen the prefrontal cortex. I use strengthen in quotes because the brain is not a muscle, it's a connection of a bundle of neurons. And so what we need to do is have more of those neurons and more connections between those neurons. So we call it cortical thickening. It's not a muscle, so strength is the wrong word. There are ways you can increase the cortical thickness of the prefrontal cortex. There are, for example, mindfulness-based stress reduction is a kind of meditation that has been shown to increase the cortical thickness of the prefrontal cortex. So that's a way. Training. As I say, cognitive therapy can remove impediments and things and train you to think better, and that's a way. So those would be two ways you could do it. There aren't a lot of easy ways to do this. We're talking about changing the fundamental way that your physical brain and your mind work. And so it's not going to be an easy thing. So MBSR would be a way to do it. There's been some really interesting research. You get people, you put in fMRI. fMRI show so it shows where the brain is metabolizing glucose. So it shows what parts of the brain are active. And so you can see how much the prefrontal cortex is. You give people questions and stuff, and you see how much the prefrontal cortex is active. You have them do like a mindfulness-based stress reduction course. 8 weeks later, you put them back in the fMRI. You can actually see it gets thicker. Which is just astounding that the physical brain can change in as little as 8 weeks by doing something like that. So many kinds of meditation actually, I think, are a little mystical and don't have much in the way of evidence for them. MBSR has a lot of research support. So I guess
That's non-deep. Was that non-deep sleep rest or something like that? NDSR.
MBSR is mindfulness-based stress reduction, but so if you want to talk about like what happens,
okay. MB.
yeah, mindfulness-based stress reduction, but so we don't really understand consciousness. But I'm going to say that before we go into any farther. We measure different kind of wavelengths, like alpha, beta waves in the brain, and we use this as a signal for which parts of the brain are operating and what they're doing. But we don't really understand in some ways why. And there's these sort of new emerging theories of consciousness in terms of the activation at different levels. So some of the really interesting research about current gen psychotropics like SSRIs affect the brain serotonin in certain ways, but some psychotropics like psilocybin, for example, change the sort of ratio of wavelengths in the brain. It changes brain activation in ways that are incredibly powerful. And so psilocybin trials, for example, have been shown to reduce depression even long-term with basically no side effects. Current gen psychotropics are incredibly problematic. SSRIs have a whole host of side effects, including some really profound sexual side effects that most people don't talk about. And it changing the ratio of these waves in sort of this way, we don't know why that makes people's mood change. And we have no idea how it's really affecting consciousness. Our theories of consciousness don't have a way to sort of explain this. So I guess this has really kind of gone off on a tangent at this point, but to sort of bring it back, MBSR, when you go into a meditative state, the ratio, the sort of normal ratio of these alpha, beta, gamma waves, etc., changes into a meditative state, and the brain actually operates differently than sort of regular kinds of consciousness. And it is sort of a resting, you do go more into rest, but it's like a very active kind of rest. It's not like taking a nap or something. So it's probably too much information, but
well, this is fascinating, and we're talking a lot here about the physical side of changing your existential orientation. But I think that cognitive behavior therapy is about the cognitive side. It's very much about the mental. So you've got these core beliefs, and you're working with the machinery that you have, and there's this directional relationship between brain and beliefs, perhaps, or maybe not beliefs directly, but some sort of physical state that affects your emotional state and affects your moods and emotions and other things. So are there things that you can do once you've honed in on these core beliefs to sort of help yourself out of a funk? Obviously, I would recommend that people see professionals if that's the sort of help that they need. But in the moment, perhaps you need something to reach to. Is there some sort of tool that we've got from cognitive behavior therapy that can help us with this?
Yeah, so thanks for drawing me back to that question. So there are many techniques. There's a book that's written for clinicians, but I just happen to have it on my desk. So it's Cognitive Behavioral Therapy by Judith Beck. Judith is the daughter of Aaron Beck. It actually is sort of what we give to people in graduate school who are sort of early, and it explains kind of the entire cognitive framework and many of the techniques that we use. And so people could kind of use it to self-treat. I don't think that's the ideal way, especially if you have like a full-on disorder, but let's say you have something less than that, you could actually use many of these techniques. But as a sort of general answer, start testing these beliefs, right? Challenge them. So when I sort of went through, the man and kind of getting angry at the door, at each stage we ask yourself, like, what does this mean about me? Why do I believe it? You could start asking yourself, like, is it true? You could learn about the cognitive biases. You could learn about sort of these maladaptive thought patterns, these cognitive distortions that we call them in psychology. If you learn both cognitive distortions and cognitive biases, that would give you a lot of insight into the way your mind works. Challenge it, use reality testing. You can change it. So one thing you can do is shift perspective. So attribute all these beliefs to someone else and then ask, like, is that person sort of being reasonable, or where are they going awry? The external perspective is much easier to assess. When we look inside, our judgment often fails in ways that it does not fail when we're looking outside. We know too much, we have too much access, and we're also too willing to overlook, and our self-judgment is often not as accurate as our other judgment. So we can shift these beliefs to someone else and then sort of treat them as a separate person and evaluate the beliefs that way. Use some of those techniques. If you really want to dive into it, the CBT book has a whole list, but they're not really designed to
Use
use on
myself.
yourself. Yeah. Yeah.
Right.
And so if someone's got to the point like they actually have like clinical depression, I really would recommend trying to get some help. Therapy, as I said, can be expensive. There are, either state, county programs, provincial programs, city programs. Many therapists have a sliding scale, so they'll offer discounted rates to at least a certain percentage of the people they're seeing. If it's starting to get to that level, though, professional help can make just a huge difference.
Yeah, I have to agree with that 100%. I want to point out one. So you mentioned biases and distortions, and this reminds me a lot of a book that I read recently called The Scout Mindset by Julia Galef.
Mhm.
And the Scout Mindset is a means of distinguishing this sort of desire to see the world clearly from what she calls the soldier mindset. And the soldier mindset is, well, I have certain beliefs, I'm going to defend them no matter what. The scout he realizes he doesn't gain anything by, ignoring certain facts and hoping for things to just kind of work out. And so I think in connection with thinking about yourself, doing the journaling, getting your thoughts out on the page so you can really examine them, and absolutely seek professional help if you need it. But another tool that I think could be helpful in this regard is just really thinking about the scout mindset and adopting it, even when you're examining yourself, and especially when you're examining yourself, because we have this sort of blind spot. We know about this sort of psychological myopia where we cannot see ourselves clearly. So when we do get any sort of handle on what's going on in there, to take the utmost care to see that really, really clearly and not biased.
Yeah, no, that sounds like a great book.
So we've gone through the sentimental process and this theory of sentiments as well. We've seen how these different, the reason I keep coming back to landscape, it seems like an apt metaphor to me, because in a landscape, you have things that are close, right? And you've got things that are a little bit more distant, a little bit more distant, a little bit more distant. I guess it's not fully descriptive of the sentimental theory, because in a sense, the things that are furthest away are also the things that are closest, because they're your core beliefs and they're affecting everything else.
Well, but in that case, you could use the entire curvature of the globe, right? It underlies the landscape and determines it. So you
Yeah,
could actually extend the metaphor just down.
that, or we could go to weather for metaphors as well. I think, like what's happening outside today is affecting my emotions. What's been happening this week is affecting my mood. There's climate systems, all that stuff. So interesting ways to think about these different sentiments. And I think just having a handle on what those things are, talking about some of the ways that you can investigate your emotions is incredibly helpful. It's helping me in my own life. So I hope others find it useful as well. Any other thoughts on this topic? I know we're going to talk a lot more in the future about, or I hope we will talk a lot more in the future about your specialty, which is sexual ethics, because that's just fascinating. But while we're on emotions, which I sort of see as the gateway into that discussion, we need this groundwork before we can even go there. Any other points that we missed?
Well, so let's talk about your podcast about flourishing. Let's talk about sort of how, what's the payoff, right? So we've talked about this kind of abstract philosophical, psychological stuff, like why, right? Why do we need to know this stuff? And one of them we've already talked about, right? It's this idea of therapy and like how can maybe I heal some of my own stuff. That's one of the payouts. It gives us a way to understand our our psychology and to potentially change if we need to, right? But let's talk about two others. The first one is there's a really significant moral boon to understanding and getting our sentiments aligned with our conscious ends. And this is actually one of the major themes of Eros and Ethos. One of the most important ethical things you can do is to very carefully cultivate your values and beliefs so that your emotions are in line with your conscious philosophy and conscious convictions. That way that we're driven to do good things, that we feel good, we feel proud when we act well, we feel bad when we act poorly, right? That when we flourish, we care about our flourishing, that we feel the importance of our friends and our lovers, we feel the importance of our children, we feel the importance of our productive work. We can make our sentiments into a kind of moral barometer of how our life is going if they are well integrated, they're well cultivated, and we can get rid of a lot of the sort of bad stuff that many of us have from childhood and our early experiences. And if we can do that, our sentiments can drive our ethics and drive us to much higher heights of flourishing than we would be able to otherwise. So I think that's really probably the most important payoff of all this understanding.
Yeah, absolutely. Aligning what you feel with what you think you ought to feel in that situation. Because it's really sort of worrying and uncomfortable when there's a disconnect between those things. I
Yeah,
should be
it's
enjoying this. Why am I
jarring.
not enjoying this?
Yeah,
No,
it's a jarring experience when you're like, I should enjoy it, but I don't. What is wrong with me, right?
yeah. I mean, this is really worrying because we look out at the world and we see people who we think they have it all, right? They have the job, they've got the beautiful spouse, they've got everything, right? But yet we know maybe we're good friends with them. Maybe it's us. Maybe we have everything, and yet we don't feel good about how our lives are going. And so, yeah, I mean, I think you said at the very beginning that emotions or sentiments more broadly are a means of experiencing our values.
Mhm.
And I mean, why have the values if you can't experience them, right?
Right. Yeah. Yeah. And, people talk about like being maybe purely rational. There are psychological disorders where people don't feel their emotions. And it turns out they don't become these sort of Kantian paragons of virtue. They actually can't make decisions because nothing seems important. One choice versus another has no compelling pull on them. It turns out pure reason is they just stop doing things and they stop caring and they just kind of fall apart. And we know that because there's disorders where that happens. They're more neurological than psychological, but it turns out those people have existed. We've studied them, and it is not possible to be a creature of pure reason, like Kant says. It just isn't. That's not the kind of creatures we are. We are kind of the kind of creatures who have sentiments, and those sentiments are important for our lives and our experience of our lives.
Well, and I think even the idea itself of pure reason is a bit of a misnomer, right? Because
Yeah, no, Kant has so many issues. Like, I'm not trying to like talk up Kant, right?
oh
But
yeah,
there
well,
are even objectivists who think like, if I could just be purely rational and just get rid of these freaking emotions, I would be so much better. And no, it turns
yeah,
out you would be giving yourself a profound disorder. You would just sit on the couch. No decision would be meaningful. Nothing would make any difference to you. And so you would have no way to adjudicate between any choice whatsoever. Reason needs motivations, and the motivations are our sentiments in some ways. And the fact that we care about things is what drives us to make good choices, right? I'm not trying to say that we should use our sentiments in favor of our reason. We should, if our sentiments are well cultivated, they should drive our reason and push us to make much better decisions using both, right? It's an
yeah.
integration of both.
And another distinction I see between what you're talking about, which is a healthy way to live, and this idea of pure reason, is that actually in that situation, reason has broken down
Mhm.
because reason relies on these automatic integrations that we make subconsciously. And if we can't utilize that knowledge because we've somehow very unnaturally cut ourselves off from it, then we're actually losing a piece of what it means to be able to reason. It
And we're losing a
requires
piece of our
that
humanity
knowledge.
too, right? Like our humanity would be, if we could do that, if we could live up to the Kantian ideal, our humanity would, we would lose a part of it, an integral part of what it means to be us, right?
Yeah, life would become very gray. And I don't think anyone really, as much as they might think they want it, actually it would be good for them in the long term.
But it would also become meaningless. And I mean that strictly speaking, we would not feel meaning about anything. Like that would be such a terrible way to experience your life. I mean, that tends to drive people to suicide when they feel like their life is entirely meaningless. I mean, like people come to me for this problem, right? And if they could actually just do that to themselves, it would be profoundly damaging.
Yeah, that's very interesting. It mirrors something that Thomas Reid, a Scottish Enlightenment philosopher, said as well, which if you're interested in that, you guys can check out my last episode of this podcast, which was on Thomas Reid and the connections between his ideas and Ayn Rand. I hope everybody else is enjoying this conversation as much as I am. Jason, I'd love to have you back. I hope to have more conversations. I think that this is a fascinating topic, and definitely recommend that everybody checks out Eros and Ethos. This is a really, really interesting read. You have another volume, several other volumes of this work in progress. Do you want to say anything about what you're working on and other ways that people can check out your work?
Sure. But one other thing, just real briefly, because I know we're out of time. The other payoff for existential orientation and sort of the sentiments is that we can understand sexual attraction and what to do about it. And there's an entire chapter 5 of my book is about this. But if anyone ever has questions like, why am I attracted to so and so, or why can I stop being attracted to this kind of person? Like chapter 5 is kind of how to understand that. So the 3 payoffs are, understanding our psychology, the moral boon, and sexual attraction. But yeah, so there's going to be a minimum of 2 volumes, maybe 3. The second volume, so the first volume is really the broad philosophical and psychological foundations to understand sexuality, sex and sexuality. And volume 2 is going to be drilling down into various topics and understanding what are they, how do they impact our flourishing, how can we engage in these things morally, or can we engage in certain things morally. I develop a theory of constitutions where I think that sort of ethics, most ethics is done sort of at a distance, where we talk about like sort of people in general. I don't think you can do sexual ethics like that. I think we need to particularize sexual ethics when we start talking about these topics. And the theory of constitutions will give us a framework to particularize it and to understand why different individuals will have different values and beliefs sexually, and that's okay, right? That flourishing is not going to be a one size fits all. Flourishing is never ever a one size fits all, right? And if we can't really understand any kind of sexuality in sort of this broad perspective, so we're going to situate it, look at all these topics, like non-monogamy, BDSM, kinks, all this kind of stuff, and really drill down into, can these things be done morally? Can they enrich someone's flourishing? Are there any things that are sort of necessarily immoral? And really kind of hit all these topics from sort of eudaimonistic perspective. So
I can't think of a better teaser for this book and for your work to come. So thanks so much. And also hopefully a teaser for further episodes of this podcast, because man, this stuff is so relevant to flourishing. So thanks again, Jason, for coming on. Everybody check out Eros and Ethos. And until next time, happy flourishing.